Welcome to our channel, everyone, where we share some of the most captivating and inspiring tales from distant worlds. Today, we present a story that begins in the depths of a grim slave market and ends in a breathtaking moment of redemption and renewal. Perhaps the most riveting part is when Emran discovers the future growing within her, a triumphant spark of hope after a lifetime of being told she was worthless. How did she find the courage to fight for that hope? And what role does Taron play in this extraordinary turn of events? Tune into the full narrative of Sold for Nothing, She Was Deemed Worthless, until one man saw her true value, to witness every twist and surprise. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to support us and ensure you never miss our next exciting stories. Leave your personal opinions in the comments. Let us know what you think and where you're listening from. No one truly looked at her, not as a being with thoughts or worth, on the blistering edge of the Hazadi slave market. Known across the star lanes as Radha's Scar, this place existed under the harsh glare of twin suns and amidst a choking atmosphere that reeked of stale sweat, scorched metals, and the acrid fumes from faulty ventilation systems. Creaking wooden walkways intertwined with metallic platforms, and the clang of distant machinery reverberated through the stagnant air. Flickering holographic banners boasted deals on all manner of goods, genetically modified dancers, hulking brutes advertised as security muscle, and docile companions guaranteed to obey. Yet amid these disturbing attractions, one figure stood apart: Emran. She was silent and still, her skin a soft amber green that caught the sunlight as though it were polished jade, laced with delicate threads of bioluminescence curling around her throat and wrists. These faint gleams pulsed in slow waves, betraying her every subtle shift in emotion. Despite her striking appearance, potential buyers barely spared Emran a glance. In a place where life was quite literally weighed and tagged, she had been deemed worthless. Too lean, too quiet, too unusual. The slaver in charge, a gruff, barrel-chested alien named Gavel, paraded up and down the makeshift auction platform, barking advertisements he could barely believe himself. Rare species, strong mental fortitude, no previous owners. The crowd either scoffed or moved on. Gavel's frustration mounted, his voice turning hoarse and edgy. He went so far as to offer her for free, just to clear his books of an eyesore that brought no profit. Emran endured it all in near silence, shoulders bowed, not in full submission, but in a sort of resigned acceptance. Each time a nearby scuffle broke out, or when a prospective buyer poked her with a neural scanner, she made no sound. For her, the world of captivity had long ago settled into a dull, unending hum of dread. It felt safer to bury hope so deeply that even she could scarcely reach it. Tiny flickers of memory cut through her sedation at times. A homeworld with turquoise rivers, laughter echoing around a warm hearth, voices that whispered of a proud heritage. But every reminder of her origin was laced with pain. The knowledge that her people, the Valora, Valora, had been practically erased in one swift genocide nearly a decade prior. Near the fringe of the auction stalls, Gavel bellowed one more time, "Seriously, take her! She's all yours, just sign the paperwork." Exasperation made him flail his arms. The crowd parted, uninterested. Some sneered, others shook their heads. A few laughed at the concept of giving a living being away for nothing. Then, at the edge of Emran's peripheral vision, a solitary figure stepped forward. He was taller than the average human, with dark hair pulled back in a short tail and sleeves rolled to reveal forearms dusted by red grit, possibly from a distant moon. The moment he halted before her, the ruckus of the crowd dimmed as though the air itself recognized a shift. Emran sensed him before she actually looked up. A subtle shift in the ambient energy around her, a hush that signaled a presence not driven by cruelty or commerce. Then her gaze flicked upward, and she noticed the faint lines around his eyes, lines of weariness and empathy. He didn't gawk at her, didn't press a scanner against her temple. Instead, he addressed Gavel in a level tone. "I'll take her." Gavel, caught between triumph and disbelief, thrust a battered data chip into the newcomer's hand. "Transfer of ownership, no fees, all final," the slaver rattled off, as if anxious to be rid of this unprofitable creature. "Just sign here." The newcomer offered a single nod, pressing his thumb against the chipped device. A small beep confirmed the transaction. Gavel let out a relieved cackle, stepping back as though he'd just offloaded a cursed heirloom. The chain that bound Emran's wrist clattered, free to be claimed. But the man, Terran, didn't snatch the chain or yank it forward. Instead, he looked at Emran with an unwavering quietness. "Come," he said softly, stepping away from the platform. Emran hesitated, her entire body braced for the usual brand of violence or sneering commands. When nothing came, she followed, her heart thrumming in her ears. As they moved through the twisted lanes of the slave market, potential buyers and sneering faces parted for them, too busy to intervene. And in that simple act of walking side by side, she felt something unusual bud within her chest, a fragile seed of possibility that, if nurtured, might take root. But after so many years of seeing hope wilt, Emran barely dared to believe. Terran led Emran toward the outskirts of Rada's Scar, away from the main landing strips and towering factories spewing acrid smoke into the air. His silent posture betrayed no immediate threat, and yet Emran's nerves stayed on high alert. She noted every detail as they passed. The rusted sign of an old workshop, the collapsed remains of what might once have been a tavern, the swirling dust devils that seemed to follow them in the scorching breeze. Eventually, they arrived at a squat dwelling built directly into a rock face. The entrance was sealed with a manual lock, a curious choice in a galaxy rife with digital security. Inside, Terran eased the door shut behind them, motioning for Emran to enter. The space was dim and smelled faintly of machine oil, spices, and something distinctly home-like that she couldn't quite identify. There was a single table, a battered cooking unit, and two chairs that looked as though they'd been salvaged from a cargo ship. At the end of a short corridor, a second door stood ajar, revealing a modest sleeping area. It wasn't large, it wasn't luxurious. But after the bleak reality of being on display like meat, it felt strangely safe. Terran gestured to an old crate near the wall. "You can sit if you want," he said. His tone was quiet, careful. Emran did so stiffly. She wasn't sure what to expect from this man who had just claimed her, especially with no payment exchange. And yet he didn't lock the door behind her, didn't bark any commands, didn't even set down rules. Instead, with some men, he opened a storage cabinet, rummaging through cans and dried provisions. "I'll make something for us to eat," he offered, glancing over his shoulder. "Unless you'd rather rest first?" Emran shook her head, not trusting her voice yet. Every muscle in her body braced for the blow that usually followed such calm. In her experience, kindness was either part of a manipulative game or a fleeting moment before cruelty returned. But Terran simply nodded as though the silence was normal and expected. As he set about heating water and chopping something that resembled root vegetables, Emran let her gaze roam the room. A cluster of mechanical tools lay scattered on a workbench, evidence of Terran's trade. The walls were lined with shelves of spare parts, half-functional circuit boards, and an ancient book whose edges curled from use. It occurred to her that he might be a repairman, someone who lived on the fringes, salvaging scraps to keep older technology running. That would explain the battered home and the manual lock. Terran was someone who didn't trust sophisticated systems, or perhaps couldn't afford them. When the stew was ready, the aroma was surprisingly appetizing, spiced with something warm and earthy that reminded her vaguely of the celebratory feasts her people once had. Though that had been so long ago, it felt more dream than memory. Terran set a simple bowl before her. "If you're hungry, eat," he said. There was no order, just a gentle invitation. Emran lifted the spoon and sipped, half expecting a bitter chemical taste. But it was good, so she kept eating. So many within the galaxy's underbelly think only of credits and exploitation. In a hostile world, genuine compassion stands out like a star in a dark nebula. Terran's quiet, patient kindness amid the brutality of Rada's Scar revealed that some acts of empathy persist even when surrounded by cruelty. This first glimmer of warmth would become a vital thread that anchored Emran to a sense of possibility. Later that evening, Terran showed her to a small side room. A narrow bed occupied one corner, with a thin blanket draped across it. "You can sleep here," he murmured, once again giving her space to accept or refuse. Emran's breath caught. Memories of cramped metal cages and cold floors filled her mind. This was the first time in years she could recall someone offering her a bed without conditions or threats. She hesitated at the doorway, half convinced it was a trick. Yet Taryn simply stepped back into the corridor, leaving her alone with her uncertainty. Emran slid onto the thin mattress, fully clothed, and stared at the low ceiling for hours, struggling to grasp that, for one night at least, she would not be caged. In the early dawn, Emran woke to the hum of Taryn tinkering in his workshop next to the main room. The sky beyond the narrow window was a murky blue, touched with the faint glow of the dual suns about to rise. For a moment she lay still, watching the subtle, luminescent lines on her forearms pulse in rhythm with her heart. She'd never had a chance to consider them anything but a liability. The slavers took advantage of her kind's distinctive glow to gauge emotional states or feign exotic appeal. But here, in Taryn's quiet dwelling, they felt almost beautiful. She sat up, her thoughts swirling with unanswered questions. Why had Taryn taken her in? What did he want in return? Was this all some elaborate deception? Mustering her nerves, she decided to approach him. If there was an ulterior motive, perhaps she could uncover it before it was too late. She found him hunched over a malfunctioning power relay, soldering iron in hand, his broad shoulders tensed at her arrival. Proof that he was aware of her presence, but he didn't look up. Instead, he carefully finished the weld. The faint smell of burning metal lingered. Only then did he set the tool aside and turn his head in her direction. "You sleep?" he asked, voice still tinged with morning roughness. Emran nodded, unsure how to voice the half-dozen queries swirling in her mind. After a beat of silence, Taryn gestured to a seat next to him. "I've got some basic rations if you're hungry, or you can join me out back. I found an underground spring that's cooler than any shower you'll find in this wasteland." She blinked at the casual tone. With a small, cautious nod, she followed him to the rear of the dwelling, where a hasty trapdoor led down to a natural cavern. The air below was unexpectedly mild, as the stone insulated against the surface heat. Tehran cranked a valve, and clear water trickled from a pipe set into the rock wall. Emran stared, memories flooding in. A distant planet where waterfalls sparkled under a turquoise sky. She stepped forward, cupping her hands to catch the water. Its chill sent a jolt through her system, awakening pieces of herself she'd long sealed away. To her surprise, Taryn didn't watch her with proprietary interest. He busied himself testing a small purifier Yunnan, verifying the water's potability. He gave her space. She realized that only someone living well below the official radar would create a hidden oasis like this. No digital records, no extraneous technology, just enough to survive. Back in the main dwelling, Taryn poured them each a small mug of steaming liquid that smelled faintly of crushed herbs. Emran tentatively sipped, bracing herself for bitterness. Instead, a subtle warmth bloomed through her chest. A faint sense of calm steadied her pulse. "Years back," Taryn began, voice low, "I was stationed off-world as a repair specialist, earned a decent living at it, but certain events made me leave." He paused, eyes turning distant. "Been living out here, away from prying eyes ever since. Fixed up this place, rigged some basic defenses, avoided trouble until I saw you standing in that market." Emran watched him carefully. "Why did you buy me?" The question fell from her lips before she could weigh the risk. He set his mug down, a soft clang echoing through the small space. "Because you shouldn't have been there in the first place," he answered quietly. "You look like someone who needed a chance to exist beyond a chain." Emran's heart tightened. A chance. Did such a thing even exist for her kind? As she mulled it over, Taryn spoke again. "No strings, Emran. I don't want your servitude. Just be here if you want. Live." The sincerity in his tone pierced her, more powerful than any brand or shock baton she'd endured. She found herself nodding, though disbelief still coursed through her veins. It felt like stepping onto a ledge, uncertain if the next step was salvation or a deadly fall. Days slipped by in a curious rhythm. Taryn often left on short runs, gathering scrap parts or bartering with fringe dwellers a few kilometers beyond Rhea's scar. Emran remained, learning the layout of the dwelling, analyzing the stacks of circuit boards, and occasionally braving the sunlight to check on the hidden spring. Little by little, a routine formed, though to call it normal would be an overstatement. Suspicion lingered. She was all too aware that kindness in her life had frequently been a precursor to betrayal. Yet each time she waited for Taryn's veneer of decency to crack, it never did. One afternoon, as Taryn patched a hole in the external generator casing, Emran felt a faint shift in air pressure. The lines of bioluminescence on her arms flickered in response. Instinct told her a storm was brewing. She recalled the particular prickle on her skin from storms on her old homeworld. Frightening but mesmerizing. Overwhelmed by the recollection, she inadvertently staggered, bracing herself against the doorframe. Taryn noticed instantly. "You all right?" he asked, setting down his tools. Emran forced a nod, but her breath came in uneven bursts. Storms rattled her memory, dredging up half-buried trauma, the cargo hold where she'd been bound, the flickering emergency lights, the savage turbulence that had tossed the vessel like a toy while the slavers yelled for sedation. She could never banish the recollection of electrified air that smelled of ozone and dread. Pain can hollow us out and leave us trapped in loneliness. Yet when someone else cares enough to acknowledge that pain without judgment, it becomes a thread that unites rather than isolates. Emran's harrowing memories of captivity found a silent resonance in Taryn's quiet empathy. Neither had a magic cure for the other's wounds, but they offered a willingness to share the weight of past traumas. The sky rumbled with the approach of swirling clouds, tinted by the double suns. Taryn motioned to a trap door near the main corridor. "Storm shelter," he explained. "It's not fancy, but the walls are insulated. We'll ride it out down there, unless you want to tough it out up here." Emran felt her pulse spike. Another trap door, reminiscent of containment. But Taryn's expression held no threat, only concern. Her survival instincts insisted that smaller spaces were dangerous, but a crash of thunder overhead ended the debate. Emran nodded. She followed him down a short ladder to a cramped bunker, lined with metal shelves containing emergency rations, first aid supplies, and a battered lantern. When he sealed the hatch, darkness surrounded them, save for the wan glow of the lantern. The storm's fury descended with a vengeance, shaking the shelter's reinforced walls. Emran's breath grew shallow, memories swirling too fast to contain. She could almost hear the slavers shouting, the clang of chains, the hum of sedation devices. Terrence sank onto a low stool opposite of her, arms resting on his knees. His gaze flicked over Emran with quiet alertness. "You can tell me to shut up, but sometimes talking helps," he offered. "First storm I rode out alone wasn't even on this planet. It was on Cestus 9, right after—" He paused, swallowing thickly. "Right after I lost someone close to me." Emran studied him in the flickering light. She saw the tension in his jaw, the faint tremor of old sorrow. "Who was it?" she asked, her voice raw. "Her name was Kellen," he murmured. "My younger sister. She got caught in crossfire during a militia crackdown. Wrong place, wrong time. By the time I realized, it was already over." The storm punctuated his words with a cannonade of thunder. He closed his eyes briefly. "After that, I fled. Ended up drifting from place to place, never settling, because everything felt like a potential war zone." Emran's own chest tightened with empathy. This man was no stranger to loss. She bent her head, fingertips grazing the luminous patterns on her wrist. "I lost everyone too," she whispered. "My entire world. My people were the Valora. They specialized in storing and interpreting memories. I was taken before the final purge, but I've dreamed of it every night. The flames devouring the temples, the screams. They harnessed us for empathic exploitation." Taryn nodded in understanding, offering no platitudes. Only the storm and the faint crackle of the lantern filled the pauses. Eventually, Emran breathed easier. The swirling panic within her dulled, soothed by the realization that she wasn't alone in grief. In that bunker, two broken souls huddled together against the thunder, neither expecting to mend the other in a single breath, but both grateful not to face the storm alone. They emerged from the shelter at dawn, blinking under the watery glare of the rising suns. The storm's debris littered the yard, broken branches and battered scraps of metal. Over the next few days, Marin resumed her cautious exploration of Taron's dwelling, learning more about the quiet corners of his existence. She discovered a hidden drawer filled with old holo photos, Taron and a younger girl, presumably Kellen, beaming at the camera. Another snapshot featured a bustling outpost on some distant world, both siblings grinning in better days. Each evening, they shared a meal, usually a humble stew of root vegetables or preserved grains. Words were sparse but meaningful. Emran started to reveal slices of her life before capture, how her community revered empathy and memory as sacred tools, how she once trained to carry the recollections of a respected elder. Terran, in turn, spoke about the freedom he once tasted as a starship mechanic, repairing vessels that soared across the galaxy. One night, while Terran tested a newly rigged solar battery, Emran hovered at the workshop entrance. She noticed the sweat clinging to his brow, how his hair fell loose around his face when he concentrated. Something stirred inside her, a gentle warmth that wasn't fear or guarded gratitude. It was an odd sense of kinship, maybe even trust, blossoming where only dread had lived before. "I see you," she said softly, stepping into the workshop. Terran turned, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Yeah," he replied, setting aside a coil of wire. She struggled to put the sensation into words. "I'm not used to being asked what I want, not used to having these quiet days without punishment." Terran's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "I'm not sure if I'm doing anything right," he confessed. "I just know I couldn't leave you in that place." Emran dared a small smile. "Thank you for letting me be me." In that moment, emotion charged the air between them. Terran slowly raised a hand as though to brush a stray lock of hair from Emran's face, then hesitated, giving her the choice. She leaned closer, letting his calloused fingertips rest against her cheek. The contact was electrifying in its gentleness. No one had touched her like that since, well, she couldn't remember when. They might have lingered in that fragile moment forever if not for the shrill beep of a sensor going off in the corner. Terran jerked back, his brow creasing. Emran's bioluminescent lines flickered anxiously, reflecting her heightened pulse. Terran scanned the readout, his expression darkening. "It's a drone signal, low-altitude sweep." Emran's chest tightened. Drones were typically employed by the Trade Authority to track escaped property or illegal operations. She'd heard the stories from other captives. Once these drones locked onto your signature, they relayed it to enforcers or private retrieval teams. A flutter of dread stirred in her gut. "They found me," Terran set his jaw. "Let's not assume the worst. Could just be a routine pass, but we should be ready, in case." He moved with methodical urgency, powering down most electronics to reduce their energy signature. Emran helped by packing away any items that might identify her as a Valora, still uncertain how the authorities would interpret a species deemed practically extinct. She forced her hands to remain steady, refusing to succumb to the panic swirling in her mind. After all, she was no longer alone. Terran's calm presence fortified her. They spent an uneasy night listening for the telltale hum of thrusters overhead. But silence reigned, and by morning it seemed the drone might have passed on without incident. Yet the reprieve only fueled a sense of impending conflict. Emran knew deep down that her freedom, this fragile sanctuary, was built upon the shaky foundation of anonymity, and anonymity could be shattered in an instant. Their fears materialized a few days later. Tehran had gone to scout for replacement parts in a nearby salvage yard, leaving Emran to tidy up the dwelling. She was just beginning to sense something was off, a prickle at the nape of her neck, when an automated delivery drone appeared outside, shining a crimson beam against the door. A recorded message crackled to life. "Warning, harboring unregistered sentient life form. Surrender or face punitive action." Emran's blood chilled. The drone's mechanical voice looped once, then fizzled out. She rushed to the window and peered outside. The horizon was empty, but that meant nothing. If the HFY authorities had flagged her presence, they could dispatch a retrieval team at any moment. Shortly after, Terran returned, brow already creased with concern. She told him about the drone. He set down the salvage he'd collected, a battered hull plating and some worn-out wiring, and exhaled a heavy breath. "They're on to us." Emran braced herself. She remembered how Gavel and his cronies had shackled her in the open market, the humiliating sensation of being labeled worthless. "What do we do?" she asked, heartbeat thrumming in her ears. Terran's eyes flicked around the room, landing on the meager supplies they had. "We make a plan. We can't just wait for them to come with stunners and cargo restraints. Fear can paralyze, but unity in the face of it sparks a strength neither could muster alone." Instead of Emran running away to spare Terran or Terran betraying her to protect himself, they decide to stand side by side. This willingness to confront danger as a team becomes a pivotal turning point, proof that their bond has evolved beyond mere survival. They spent the evening gathering gear and deciding on the next steps. Terran retrieved an old pulse pistol from a hidden floor compartment, checking its charge. He also unearthed a set of forged identity papers that he hoped would help them slip past basic checks at outposts or starports. Emran assisted by disabling the property's automated locks, ensuring that if they needed to flee quickly, they wouldn't be trapped by their own defenses. As the sun sank below the horizon, they sat down for what might be their final meal in this place. The tension was palpable. Emran swallowed hard, remembering the fleeting sense of safety she'd finally begun to taste. She stared at Taryn, who appeared lost in thought, fingers drumming against the worn tabletop. "I'm not leaving you," he said suddenly, as if reading her mind. She blinked. "But if the authorities catch me, they might just fine you." He cut her off, gentler this time. "No, you're not property, Emran. You never were. And I won't let them treat you like contraband. If we escape together. If we fight together. Understand?" Emran nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to protest, to tell him that he deserved a life unburdened by her troubles. But something had shifted between them, a mutual devotion grown from the seeds of trust. She couldn't deny it any longer. Instead, she reached across the table, her fingertips brushing his. He clasped her hand, and for a moment the weight of fear lifted. They left under the cover of darkness, departing through a narrow gorge that Taryn claimed would bypass most sensor grids. The atmosphere tingled with anticipation, as though the planet itself sensed their flight. Emran glanced back only once, taking in the silhouette of the dwelling that had been her first real home since her childhood. Then she turned, setting her jaw, determined to move forward. No more hiding. Their immediate goal was Jasmine, an old associate of Taryn's, rumored to run a covert starport beyond the heavily policed zones. If anyone could get them off-world unnoticed, it would be Jasmine. But they would have to be quick and lucky. Emran's stomach churned with the memory of the mechanical drone's threat. By now, that drone's message would have sparked a bounty or an alert. She couldn't be sure what kind of hunters might be on their tail or how long it would take them to close in. Nightfall made travel easier, though it did little to soothe the tension in Emran's chest. She and Taryn navigated the rocky terrain in near silence, guided only by the faint luminescent strips on Emran's forearms and a battered handheld scanner. Every shift of gravel, every gust of wind, seemed to shout their location to potential pursuers. They pressed on, driven by necessity, hoping to reach Jasmine before dawn. They found the covert starport huddled behind towering cliffs that partially concealed a rust-stained hangar. Rusted signage flickered overhead, proclaiming callous repairs in multiple languages, though half the letters were missing. Armed with caution and the pulse pistol, Taryn led Emran inside. The hangar's interior was a labyrinth of disassembled engines, half-repaired hulls, and stacked crates of questionable cargo. The whir of an ion welder echoed from the back, punctuated by the occasional burst of curses. A lean figure slid out from under a small courier ship, plasma torch in hand. Jasmine was an Ovani female with cropped silver hair and a suspicious glare that flicked between Taryn and Emran. "You owe me, Taryn," she greeted, voice resonating in the cavernous space. "Big time," Taryn offered a tight smile. "I know, and I'm prepared to settle accounts if it gets us off this rock." Jasmine eyed Emran, her gaze lingering on the glowing lines along Emran's wrists. "She's the reason you're running?" Emran stiffened, feeling the weight of the question. She could practically sense Jasmine evaluating the risk she represented. Taryn nodded. Trade Authority flagged her as unregistered property. Jasmine snorted. "Property, right." She tossed the plasma torch onto a nearby table, scratching at a scar on her cheek. "You realize you're bringing a lot of heat my way?" "Yes," Taryn admitted, "but you're the only one I trust for a job like this." For a moment, Jasmine's guarded expression softened, as though recalling a time Taryn had come through for her. She exhaled and waved them over to a rust-patched starship sitting on the far side of the hangar. "That's the Sparrowhawk. It's a short-range craft, but I've got a warp booster we can attach for a single jump off-world." Emran eyed the battered hull. "Will it fly?" Jasmine's lips quirked in a grim half-smile. "It'll fly well enough to get you to the Verge systems, where the authorities' net is thinner. After that, you're on your own." Despite the suspicion and the risk of drawing attention, Jasmine chooses to help. Sometimes unity comes from the most unexpected allies, those who have walked similar roads of desperation and know that genuine help is rarely found in polite society. They worked through the night, Terran assisting with the warp booster installation, while Emran quietly reprogrammed the ship's transponder codes. She was no expert, but her years in captivity had forced her to pick up bits and pieces of technical knowledge. Combined with Terran's mechanical savvy, they made decent progress. Around dawn, Jasmine approached with a handheld device. I've got patrol chatter on a wide frequency. They're describing a human mechanic and a glowing companion. Looks like the retrieval squad's on its way. Emran felt a jolt of panic. How close? Too close. Time to go. They hurriedly sealed the Sparrowhawk's hull, double-checking life support and navigation. With the engines rumbling, Jasmine slapped the hull in a farewell gesture. Keep those transponder codes cycling and don't linger in any sector. Good luck, Terran. Amran. Terran paused, meeting Jasmine's gaze. Thank you. You won't regret this. She laughed bitterly. I already regret it, but do me a favor. Survive. Moments later, Emran and Terran were strapped into the Sparrowhawk's cramped cockpit. A countdown beeped on the console. With a roar, the ship lifted off, thrusters kicking up clouds of dust and sparks. The battered craft rattled, resisting gravity's hold. Emran's heart hammered. She risked a glance out the small viewport, glimpsing Jasmine's silhouette disappearing beneath the swirl of exhaust. Then the starport was gone behind them, replaced by a stormy sky. Air traffic alarms flashed red on the dashboard, indicating multiple signals converging in the region. Terran grit his teeth, adjusting the flight path. Hang on, he muttered, punching the ship into a steep ascent. Emran clenched the sides of her seat. The hull rattled as if it might tear apart. Then, with a final shudder, they broke through the upper atmosphere. Stars spread out before them, cold and glittering, the ultimate promise of freedom, if they could reach it. The jump through fringe space was a nerve-wracking gamble. The warp booster attached by Jasmine was a jury-rigged device never meant for more than 1 or 2 short hops. Alarms blared as Terran coaxed the craft to align with a swirling warp corridor. Emran's heart slammed against her ribs, each breath thick with adrenaline. But Terran's skill at the console was evident. His fingers danced over the controls, modulating thruster output and smoothing the chaos of the warp bubble. When they finally dropped out of the jump, the stars looked different. They had emerged far from the well-policed routes. Emran let out a shaky breath. We made it? Terran laughed softly, a sound tinged with disbelief. We're not in the clear, but we're beyond the authorities' immediate reach. He checked the console readings, verifying that the transponder was still scrambling, their signature. The Verge systems, mostly backwater colonies, but we might find a safe harbor here. The tension in Emran's shoulders eased. A wave of exhaustion replaced the frantic urgency she'd carried for so long. She sagged back in her seat, letting her eyes roam the unfamiliar starfield. In that moment, a sense of awe washed over her. This was freedom in its raw form. No shackles, no slavers' chains, no watchful drones overhead. She could hardly believe it. They landed on a remote moon orbiting a gas giant, whose swirling colors painted the sky in pastel ribbons. The small settlement near the landing pad resembled a frontier outpost, complete with squat buildings cobbled together from salvaged materials. Terran paid the docking fee to a board attendant who didn't even glance at Emran's distinctive glow. Here, no one asked questions. Perhaps they'd seen too many fugitives, too many desperate travelers just trying to stay ahead of the law. Over the next few days, Terran and Emran slowly established a life on this unnamed frontier. They bartered for a small, run-down shelter near a rocky outcropping that overlooked a narrow valley. Emran found a clear stream behind the structure, an echo of the hidden spring she'd used on Rada's scar. She helped patch the roof with scraps of metal. Terran rigged a generator from spare parts, ensuring they had minimal power. In many ways, it was reminiscent of Terran's old place, simple, humble, but theirs. Emran learned from the locals that the settlement existed far outside official galactic trade routes. Most inhabitants were exiles or outcasts living on the fringes. No one cared that she was Valora or that Terran was a mechanic with a questionable background. They only wanted to survive, to eke out an existence on the edges of civilization. In that quiet space, unburdened by the constant threat of discovery, Emran finally had time to explore her own identity. Each night, she wrote down fragments of memories, songs, proverbs, traditions, hoping to preserve the culture of her decimated people. Taryn found a battered data pad for her, and she spent hours recording every scrap of recollection that surfaced. Sometimes the process brought tears. Other times it sparked laughter as she recalled moments of joy from a distant childhood. One evening, as the orange sun dipped behind jagged cliffs, Taryn handed her a chipped, carved stone pendant. The symbol etched into it was foreign to him, but looked strikingly close to the velour emblem for hope. "I found this in a scrap box," he said sheepishly. "Reminded me of you." Emran pressed her fingertips to its surface, tears prickling her eyes. She stared at Taryn, seeing him bathed in warm twilight. Without speaking, she leaned in, and their lips met in a gentle, searching kiss. The moment carried no urgency, just a sense of shared belief in a new future. Time passed in relative calm. Emran and Taryn created a modest existence, far from the eyes of any authority, forging bonds with the scattered souls who called this moon home. Taryn repaired old machinery, while Emran sometimes aided the locals with her unique empathic talents, especially those grappling with trauma from harsh travels. At first, her help was merely intuitive, her empathic senses guiding her. But the more she practiced, the more she realized she still held the seeds of her people's ancestral knowledge. Her mother, once a custodian of Valora memory archives, had taught her that empathy wasn't just a curse, it was also a healing art. On a crisp morning, Emran stood outside their dwelling, watching purple clouds drift across the pale sky. A breeze teased strands of her hair, carrying the faint scent of mineral-rich dust. Taryn stepped out behind her, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. They often shared these silent dawns, each sunrise a reminder that they were alive and free. She turned to face him, about to mention a fleeting recollection of a Valora lullaby, when her thoughts took a dizzying spin. A wave of vertigo hit her, forcing her to steady herself against Taryn. Concern etched his features. "Emran? It's nothing," she whispered, swallowing hard. Yet the feeling persisted. A swirl of physical unease mixed with an odd flicker of excitement deep in her chest. Over the next few days, the dizzy spells returned, accompanied by gentle waves of nausea in the mornings. Despite the hardships of her past, Emran was far from naive. She recognized these signs. A realization dawned on her, at first too unbelievable to accept, but soon impossible to deny. One late afternoon, she found Taryn adjusting solar panels near the rocky outcropping. The sun illuminated him, catching glimmers of metal in his tool belt, and she paused, admiring how easily he'd adapted to life here, how natural he looked repairing, building, fixing. But a deeper conversation pressed in her mind. Finally, she mustered the courage to approach. "Tehran," she said softly. He turned, noticing the serious cast to her expression. She exhaled, bracing herself for the enormity of her words. I think I'm pregnant." He froze. For an instant, the weight of her statement hovered between them, thick as the hush before a desert storm. Then Taryn set his tools aside, stepping closer. His eyes searched hers. "You're sure?" Emran nodded, emotion thickening her voice. "I've been feeling the signs. My cycle, the sickness in the mornings. Everything points to yes." A rush of conflicting emotions flickered across Taryn's face. Astonishment, concern, wonder. Finally, he reached out, gently resting a hand against her stomach. The contact felt profoundly intimate. Tears burned at Emran's eyes, and she let out a shaky laugh. Hope is the final triumph of a life once overshadowed by captivity. Emran and Taryn's journey from bondage and guilt to freedom and renewal reaches its pinnacle in this moment. The promise of a child is a powerful testament to how far they have come and how boldly they choose to believe in the future. That evening, as the sky turned crimson and gold, Taryn and Emran sat on the small porch they'd fashioned from scrap wood. A cluster of wild moonflowers bloomed along the cliffside, their petals shimmering under the fading light. The hush between them was warm, an unspoken acknowledgement of a new chapter. "I never thought I'd have a family," Taryn admitted quietly, hands clasped together as though he wasn't sure what to do with them. "After Kellen died, I swore I'd never get close to anyone again. I was too afraid of losing them." Emran placed her hand over his. "Sometimes it feels like all I've known is losing. My people, my freedom, my sense of self. But then I met you, and I found all these little pieces of life worth holding on to." He turned his hand, lacing his fingers with hers. Are we ready for this? A tremor of uncertainty danced along her spine. She thought of the lingering threat from the trade authority, the possibility that bounty hunters might one day track them down. But the baby, the child, represented a future unshackled from the past. Emran squeezed Taryn's hand and answered softly, "We have each other. That's more than I ever dared hope for." In the weeks that followed, they prepared for parenthood in the best ways they could, often improvising. There were no advanced medical facilities on this moon, no prenatal wards, or sophisticated diagnostic gear. Emran relied on her empathic awareness to sense the child's growth, and Taryn meticulously calibrated a handheld scanner, borrowed from a traveling medic. Each time the scanner pinged with a faint heartbeat reading, their eyes lit with a shared mixture of joy and trepidation. Friends they'd made in the settlement contributed whatever they could. Blankets crafted from local fibers, dried herbs said to ease nausea, even a worn but serviceable cradle hammered together from ship scraps. Emran felt that sense of community, a foreign experience after so many years of seeing only cruelty and indifference. Here, it seemed, compassion wasn't so rare after all. Some nights, sleep eluded her as she grappled with old nightmares, visions of chains and callous slavers. She would jerk awake, heart pounding, certain she'd hear the whir of a scanning drone outside. But Taryn was always there, arms encircling her with gentle reassurance, whispering that they were far from the horrors of Radha's scar. Over time, she began to trust that promise. Eventually, she ventured out alone to the nearby hills, an act of confidence she never would have considered on Radha's scar or while on the run. She found a quiet vantage point overlooking a valley where luminescent insects danced through the twilight. Settling onto a flat rock, she placed a hand on her abdomen and closed her eyes, focusing on the new life within. She recalled the old Valora prayer for renewal, a half-remembered verse about rebirth after devastation. And in the hush of that moonlit valley, she whispered it aloud, letting her voice carry across the emptiness. An unexpected calm washed over her, as though her ancestors listened from some distant realm. She sensed that despite the tragedy of losing her planet and people, she still carried a piece of them forward. This child would be Valora and human, a symbol of worlds brought together through resilience and love. When she returned to the house, Taryn was already waiting, concern etched in his posture. "I woke up and you weren't here," he said, relief flooding his features. She walked into his arms and rested her head against his chest. "I needed to remember where I came from, and to accept that I can still shape what lies ahead." His embrace tightened. She felt his heartbeat, a comforting, steady rhythm. "You're never alone," he murmured. "Not anymore." In that moment, Imran realized just how far she'd traveled, not merely across the galaxy, but through the labyrinth of her own mind and scars. She had journeyed from someone who expected every kindness to come with a cruel price, to someone who could stand beneath a starlit sky and claim happiness as her right. Taryn's gentle devotion and her own enduring spirit had forged a bond that neither slaver's threat nor leftover fear could easily break. As the weeks turned to months, the valley bloomed with strange flowers adapted to the moon's dusty soil, and Emran's belly grew. Neighbors who once viewed her and Taryn with mild curiosity now greeted them with warm smiles, sometimes dropping off small gifts of food or handcrafted trinkets. The settlement might have been a ragtag place of scavengers and outcasts, but it fostered a sense of solidarity that bolstered their hopes for the future. One late afternoon, they sat on a makeshift bench outside their home, watching the sky shift from gold to deep lavender. Taryn stroked Emran's hair as she leaned against him, the baby stirring softly within her. She felt the rising tide of life, the hush of contentment in the twilight. She closed her eyes, inhaling the cool air. The final shards of her old captivity fell away, replaced by a sense of profound gratitude. "We should give them a name," Emran murmured, one hand over her stomach. "A blend of our worlds, maybe." Taryn's gaze lit with quiet enthusiasm. "What about Kella?" he suggested, lips curving into a tender smile. "In memory of my sister, and a nod to your Valora roots with the meaning of light in your language." Emran's breath caught, tears pricking her eyes again. She nodded, pressing her forehead to Taryn's. In that simple exchange, they built a bridge between past grief and future hope. The final rays of the day gilded them in warmth, and from the edge of the cliff, a gust carried the aroma of fresh growth, the promise of new beginnings. Though the galaxy at large might never know the epic tale of Emran and Terran, here in this humble outpost, their story of survival and rebirth shone like a lone star in the night. She had been sold for nothing, labeled worthless, yet she discovered an unbreakable worth within herself, because one man had the courage to see her humanity, and she had the resolve to claim it. Their journey wasn't the stuff of grand legends or regal histories, but of quiet heroism built on small acts of compassion, trust, and resilience. Together, they would meet the future, hand in hand, hearts entwined. And if danger ever dared to reappear, they would stand side by side as they always had, with a conviction stronger than any chain that tried to bind them. Thank you for joining us on this emotional voyage through worlds unknown. From the harsh markets of Rada's Scar to the quiet hope of a hidden moon, Emran's journey reminds us that genuine worth can't be measured in credits or chains. Her final stand, embracing a new life and a child on the horizon, proves that perseverance and love can break free from the darkest bonds. If you enjoyed Sold for Nothing, she was deemed worthless until one man saw her true value. Make sure to subscribe for more incredible tales we'll be sharing soon. Your comments fuel our passion, so let us know your thoughts on Emran and Terran's trials and where you're tuning in from. Be part of our community as we continue to bring you more inspiring stories that celebrate resilience, courage, and the triumph of the human and sometimes not so human spirit.